name is Steve Abel, and I'm very happy to be hosting this webinar in which we, the Green Party, are going to be talking about our fantastic new sustainable agriculture policy. And we're very happy to be talking with our very much appreciated Member of Parliament, Eugenie Sage. I'm going to begin with a karakia, or a whakatauki actually. Manaki whenua, manaki tangata, haere whakamoa, care for the land, care for the people, go forward. And I think that embodies a principle of sustainable agriculture in the whakatauki. So Eugenie Sage is one of our members of Parliament. She is presently based in Banks Peninsula. She's been a Greenie MP since 2011, and she's currently the Minister of Conservation in this government of the last 3 years. She's the Minister for Land Information, and she's the Associate Minister for the Environment. Being a very modest person, I'm not allowed to talk too much about her long list of achievements, but most recently, an excellent achievement has been securing $1.3 billion for nature-based jobs. And that relates to, in part, the Department of Conservation. And I first met Eugenie back in the late 1990s when we were both campaigning to save the West Coast native forests from being logged by timberlands, the crown logging of those forests. And so that's over 20 years ago now, and it's a great pleasure to be with Eugenie and the Green Party, and now talking about this other all-important issue for our nation, and that is agriculture. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Eugenie Sage.
Pomare, Steve. Kia ora, ngā mihi nui, kia koutou to everyone watching online. And if we get a really strong party vote, really look forward to, Steve, you joining us in Parliament.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope so too. Get out there, party vote. Green, that is. So thanks for joining us. It's actually extraordinary to imagine that we got now 32 days until the election. I think we were going to have an election this weekend, weren't we? So it's now 32 days away. I was ready for it this weekend, but I think it's probably a good thing given the COVID challenges. Now, just last Saturday, you made an announcement of our agriculture policy. And how do you feel about that?
Kia ora. Well, it was with James Shaw and Marama Davidson, and it was on an amazing organic farm in Leeston. And it really represented what the Green Party wants in our Farming for the Future package. We know that farmers are really important in growing food and exporting, but we want a farming situation where we're looking after our climate, our waterways, and our recovery sustainably from COVID-19. And I guess, Steve, it's been through COVID that some of us have thought a bit more about where our food comes from, not just from the supermarkets, but we're really lucky here in Aotearoa that we grow such a lot of food here and we export to the world. But we need to do so much more to help farmers and growers transition away from intensive farming, which often harms nature, to farming systems that are much more regenerative and much more sustainable and reduce our emissions and protect our waterways. So the Green Party's Farming for the Future plan is all about doing that so that we have sustainable food, which is good for everyone and which is good for the planet and for our climate.
Yeah. Yeah, very much so. I think the thing that was so striking about the first lockdown was that we realized that when our society or our economy stopped, it seemed that nature gave a great sigh of relief. And that's something of an indictment on the way we're doing things. And I think in terms of agriculture, that's has to be the front line of how we find a way of having a healthy society that doesn't harm and destroy nature. So why is it that agriculture is so important in terms of the climate challenge?
Agriculture is really important for the climate because 48% of our emissions come from agriculture. And because we use a lot of artificial fertiliser, which has enabled dairy cow numbers in New Zealand to increase to over 6.5 million. And it's also that huge fertiliser use contributes nitrous oxide, which is one of the more potent, long-lived greenhouse gases. And it's also allowed that intensification, and the cow urine that leaches into the soil, into the waterways, is really bad for river health. And so it's the emissions also from ruminants when they're belching that also contributes to greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah. And so what is the, you spoke about the emissions into waterways. In terms of the specific efforts to address that, what are the sort of policy levers that we're using this agriculture policy?
Well, the Farming for the Future plan, one of the elements is a levy on artificial fertiliser use. It's about 2 cents a tonne. It'll be about $1,500 a year for dairy farmers and about $1,200 a year for sheep and beef. And that's an economic incentive to reduce the use of artificial fertilisers. We also want to ensure that all the revenue that the levy generates is reinvested back into assisting growers and farmers to make the transition to more regenerative, sustainable agriculture. And one of the other things is ensuring that through the National Policy Statement on Freshwater, there is already a cap on the amount of nitrogen used per hectare. It's about 190 kgs annually. We want to reduce that and phase it out so that we really shift away from urea and these synthetic fertilisers.
So, I mean, I understand there's even been studies done that show that we don't need synthetic nitrogen in our farming systems. And so this seems like a long overdue position for a political party to take. Is any other party taking a similar position of phasing out the synthetic nitrogen?
I think Forest and Bird said that they wish that other parties would adopt some of the elements of our Farming for the Future plan. And of course, there's been a 670% increase in the use of artificial fertilisers since the mid-90s, and that's contributed to the huge intensification of farming. So we can, and a lot of farmers overseas move much more to ensuring that in New Zealand we used to use clover as the major nitrogen fixer and to use organic compost and the like. We don't need to use these artificial fertilisers, and the farming system that it creates is highly intensive and highly polluting.
Yeah, and so in terms of the specifics of the impact of that big impact of nitrogen, what is that on waterways?
So not only is it a problem for the climate, but it also means when nutrients leach through the soil into waterways, cows urinate, that's got a lot of nitrogen in it as well. It has health impacts. It interferes with hemoglobin and oxygen uptake in the blood. It's also been associated with bowel cancer in studies overseas. And so in some areas in Canterbury, it already exceeds the limits of the World Health Organization. And it's really bad at much lower levels than it is for humans for fish and aquatic life. So we don't want nutrient pollution in our waterways in the same way that we don't want sediment pollution.
And why are you opting to target it at the input stage rather than only at the output stage, where it seems to me the industry prefer us to be focusing on the diffuse losses of nitrogen from the system, but we're saying here, no, we need to manage it at the input stage, actually?
So there's a lot more certainty focusing it on the inputs, actually on fertilisers sold, rather than on estimates using overseer of what might be leaching out. There's too much uncertainty there, and it's not an effective tool. Brilliant.
I completely agree with that. I think it's a great part of the policy and a really bold, innovative part of the policy to focus on that input stage. So where are we heading with this sort of policy, Eugenie? We've got farmers doing amazing stuff in the country, organic and regenerative farming. Can you tell us something about what regenerative farming is and what it means?
Was in Leaston recently talking to farmers there with the Quorum Sense group, And it is working with other farmers to look at what works for them. What sort of variety of pasture grasses? How do we improve animal health more? If you take out artificial fertiliser, you reduce the stocking, you better manage the pasture, as we've done traditionally in New Zealand. And so you have a system that is much more in sync and working with nature, ensuring that waterways, there's riparian planting to buffer the waterways, that there's shade in summer for animals, and a much more diverse sort of foraging mix as well, and ensuring that there's attention to microclimates and what the land best supports in terms of what it can best grow.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds glorious. So in terms of, we're here talking openly about this need for fewer cows, in a system like this that's less intensive, where we've got a more diverse system and there would be fewer animals on the land. What's the real world impact for that on farmers? I mean, the sort of knee-jerk reaction is, oh, well, if there's fewer cows, there'd be less money to make, and so the farmers wouldn't be profitable anymore. Is that the reality on the ground with regenerative farming?
Well, I think what we've seen with the dairy boom is that a lot of farmers really trapped in debt, really high capital costs, and having to be servicing big mortgages is stressful for them, for the land, for animals. And people like Alison Jews, veterinarian, have done a lot of work about farm profitability and how if you reduce the input costs, you actually have more profit on farm. The stress for the farmers is less, similarly on the animals. And Molesworth, which is our largest farm in Aotearoa, in the Marlborough area, Pāmu has the lease on that, and they weren't at all affected by Mycoplasma bovis because all of their animals are born on farm and they go off at the end of their life. They've significantly reduced the stocking regime there because it's a dryland area. So it's looking at what are the lands that we are farming and what can it actually support. And we have got an international record at growing food. We've got a 100% clean green image. It's making that more of a reality and putting less stress on the whole system.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And Pāmu is one of the places where they're innovative with getting rid of PKE. And we're now saying as a policy that we're going to get rid of PKE, palm kernel expeller, as a supplement feed, and also other unsustainable supplement feeds that are imported from areas where rainforests could be being destroyed to produce it. So that's another innovative policy here contained, isn't it?
Well, Pāmu has got rid of PKE. They started that in 2017. If they can do it as a major farmer, because again, it's this artificial feed that allows a major increase in stock numbers, and rather than being grass-fed or having just extra forage crops growing on farm. So it's a way of de-intensifying the system and not contributing to rainforest destruction in Indonesia and elsewhere.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Now, in terms of locally grown food, how important is that? We've got a proud tradition in the Greens, Gareth Hughes, Stephen Browning, of working on these issues towards us being more aware of where our food comes from. Where does New Zealand stand on that, and how can we do better?
Well, it's been the Greens through Stefan and Gareth's efforts, and before that, Sue Kedgley with country of origin labelling. People want to buy local, but unless we have country of origin labelling, consumers don't know. So the policy also provides for country of origin labelling to be applied not just to fruit and vegetables, but that are fresh, but also to frozen, to canned, and to meat, and a much wider range of products. One of the major issues at the moment is that pork can be imported, and imported pork can come from countries which don't have anything like our animal welfare standards. So if meat is labelled in terms of where it's from, I think a lot more New Zealanders will buy locally grown pork that's raised in accordance with much better animal welfare standards.
Yeah. So just very briefly, what is the animal welfare position we're taking on this? We're not opposed to livestock farming, but we're talking about the need for it to be much more humane.
So we, in the policy, are promoting having an animal welfare commissioner, someone who can really champion the safety and health and happiness of animals that we have the privilege of eating, and ensure that it's separate from the Ministry of Primary Industries, which is much more focused on sort of promoting the industry. So animals need their own champion through something like a Commissioner for Animal Welfare. Yep. And it has been the Greens, Mojo Mathers, with the major campaign, and then working with egg producers to significantly improve the standards for hens, and similarly with getting rid of farrowing crates and work in the animal welfare area that Mojo and Gareth have also led. So we want happy animals, and that's what part of the Farming for the Future package is about.
Yeah, sounds good. So in terms of that, back to that local thing, I mean, we're also talking about more support for community-produced food, community gardens, urban food. What sort of strategies do we have around that?
When I was a kid, we used to go down to Uncle's farm in the holidays, but a lot of urban kids don't get that opportunity now, and yet they're with enviro schools, with garden to table, organisations like that ensure that tamariki know that food grows in the soil, know that it comes from animals, and just establishing that connection between urban environments and rural environments. And there's been a huge mahi done throughout the country by organisations like Kaibosh, KaiCycle, recovering food, because too much of our food is wasted. All of the energy that's put into growing it, transporting it, doesn't always lead to it being eaten. So it's investing in organisations like that are working to recover food, run community gardens, community composting schemes, so that we've got that much closer association in urban areas with the soil and with growing food. Yeah,
it sounds fantastic. And we have had a nice yes to a Minister for Animal Welfare coming in on the chat. And soon we will segue to questions, because people have been putting in questions on the chat. Actually, I might throw you one of those now, if that's all right, Eugenie, if you're willing. One question that came up is about the synthetic nitrogen phase out, and the current timing would mean it would be phased out by 2037. I wonder if there's grounds for it to be phased out sooner, given evidence around climate and water pollution, and also the point you also made about the issues, the health impacts of it, which we're becoming clearer about as time goes on and research comes in. Do you think there could be grounds for us speeding up the phase out at some point in the future?
Well, I guess, and I know people like Greenpeace have talked about Sikkim in India, where you've got sort of tens of thousands of farmers who have banned the use of artificial fertiliser. There, though, very sophisticated, smaller subsistence farming, where there's a closer association with the land, where people have got that understanding of the nutrients that you need to provide through things like compost. And at a smaller individual scale, I think for some of the large farms here and the change in farm practice, do want to phase it in, so people know that it's coming and can significantly adjust their systems. Because if we're reducing herd numbers, that takes a bit of time, and just learning what the soil needs and how else those needs can be met, and getting back into more use of clover for fixing nitrogen.
That's great. And I've got a question. We hear this term agroforestry. Can you tell us anything about that?
I know there's been concern about some of the long-term carbon farming and the conversion of sheep and beef country into forests. And so there the plan provides for a review of the National Environmental Standards for plantation forestry. We don't want pine monocultures. Within the Canterbury High Country recently, there was a 100-year-old fence which had totara posts. We need to be planting totara and using totara because it doesn't require copper, chrome, arsenic, any of those chemical preservatives, and yet it can last out in all weathers for a century or so. So with agroforestry, a mix of trees with sheep often grazing underneath them, and the Farming for the Future plan also ensures that we have a greater diversity of species that we're planting. It's not just pine.
Yeah, great. Completely agree. Now we've got another question. How do we make food more affordable in New Zealand while targeting the higher value end of the export market? Because this seems to be a sort of perennial challenge. I know it is for me personally, as I can't really afford organic food. And what we really want is for conventional food to be more sustainably produced with less chemicals and less inputs.
Yeah, it's about food democracy. One way is, I think, the whole food insecurity issue. There's been quite an investment in government about assisting food banks and others, as well as we need through green policy to ensure that everyone has a decent income, which is what our guaranteed minimum income scheme is about. But it's also ensuring that things like ugly fruit and ugly veg, that it doesn't meet those standards of perfection that the supermarkets ask for, and that's often cheaper. It's ensuring that growers get a really good return. And I think we do need to look at what happens in the supermarkets and the margins there, because it's not going back a decent return often to the growers. So it's that ugly fruit and veg, and more skills through things like community gardens and the like for people growing their own food in their own vegetable gardens, because it's amazing the range that you can produce over summer. Not that I have lately because I haven't had time, but really like getting out into the garden.
Yeah, and do you think hemp farming has a future?
Was really interested when some of the hemp growers came in and produced a range of the products that you can make from hemp, including plant-based plastics. It's a very fibrous plant, and if we go back to having hemp ropes, for example, would be brilliant for things like mussel farming instead of the plastic ropes that are used at the moment. The one thing we need to be careful of, it's called a weed for a reason. It is so vigorous in the way it grows that making sure that it's quite carefully grown so it's not spreading and becoming an invasive weed in some of our Indigenous forests and shrublands. But definitely in terms of the potential to use hemp in everything from food to fibre to ropes to clothing, it's got a multitude of uses. And I think we should be growing flax more. Because Māori harvested flax and just used the fibres. So it's moving away from a lot of the introduced species and looking at what we have that are Indigenous to Aotearoa.
Yeah. Kia ora to that. I've got another question. I have one that says, modern industrial agriculture requires far more energy input than ends up on the consumer's plate. Interestingly worded, approximately 10 to 1. The label sustainable doesn't mean much as long as this is true. Will net energy return be considered in the proposed sustainability accreditation scheme?
Great question. Thank you to whomever asked it, because we hadn't really touched on that. The Farming for the Future plan also involves a sustainability accreditation scheme. Ireland has had one for some time, the Origin Green Scheme. And one journalist just mentioned that it meant her father was just lifting his game in terms of how he farmed, because it gave people credit for doing things that were less impactful on nature and moving in that direction of being more sustainable. So the green policy promotes an accreditation scheme. The criteria for it would be developed in the next term of government, and net energy use is a very good idea to include, because it then that is relevant to carbon, relevant to the climate, and it's often heavy use of machinery that happens in the growing space, and so it's looking at all of those inputs that contribute to climate emissions so we stabilise the climate. And while we've got electric bikes, electric cars, I've seen electric side-by-sides and some of the quad bikes. So it's just making that shift And if you have an energy criteria in there, it helps people measure what their energy use is and what their vehicle use is.
Great. We have another question in on the chat. How do we think the big dairy industry will react to this policy? And I have a sort of supplement to complement that question is, how concerned should we be about upsetting the conventional dairy industry and the Fonterras of this world as a Green Party advocating for sustainable agriculture?
So I think on the TV coverage of the Farming for the Future plan, we saw a Waikato farming representative who was not supportive, but we've got a lot of farmers that are really leading in terms of having, a decade or more ago started consumers and working directly selling produce to market rather than always going through a third party. We've got a lot of farmers that are experimenting with different forage and pasture grasses. So it's a bit of a bell curve, and it's some of the folk in the middle and at the tail end that's why things like the nitrogen levy, it's to help them move down that curve more towards a more sustainable outcome. So big dairy, I think, probably may have some issues, but even with big dairy, they're looking at just improving the breeding of cows to extend their life because of the concern about 20% of dairy herds being culled every year because they've got health or reproductive issues. So there are some things that we share in common, wanting much better animal welfare, but we've just got a different way of going about that.
That sounds good. Now, I've got a question about water pricing. It's a challenging issue, water pricing, and I remember at the 2017 election that it was a big discussion point. David Parker came out with a proposal of putting a price on water, and it seemed to get the kibosh by New Zealand First and the coalition arrangements. Can you tell us something about why we need to think about water pricing and what the challenges are?
Kia ora. So that is what happened. It was Green Party policy that there be a charge on the commercial use of water because when you value something like that, you're more likely to use it carefully, and because of the huge increase in water takes for irrigation and agricultural intensification that we've seen over the last 2 decades, particularly in areas like Canterbury, Hawke's Bay. And yes, we've got a drying climate, we've got more extensive drought, so that does mean a more resilient farming system has to recognise what are some of the crops that are better in a dryland environment. But a charge for water would also ensure that the revenue in the green policy would be invested back into assisting farmers and growers to make the transition. In this term of government, the Greens have worked really constructively with Labour and with New Zealand First on water quality issues, which David Parker has led, and that's resulted in a much stronger national policy statement for fresh water under the RMA, stronger bottom lines there. We need to focus on allocation next, and that needs to be done in a treaty framework because that's the complexity there. How do we ensure that the treaty rights for forest fisheries and waters are actually within a modern framework? And if there is to be a charge on the commercial use, what portion of that revenue goes to Māori? So all of those big policy issues will have to be teased through and worked through.
Yeah, very good. Yes, a worthy challenge. Another question coming from Emily. How do we get farmers and those in the ag community to get on board with these progressive ideas? Emily says she finds it hard to initiate the conversation when they know what works for them or their farms, however the change is necessary. So how do we plan on getting farmers on board? And I wonder if you could tell us more about the ways that we're wanting to assist in the transition of farmers to regenerative farming in terms of our investment in it financially?
So some organisations, like the one I mentioned, Quorum Sense, they have started by having field days, one in Gore recently around winter grazing, and I think over 100 people came to that. So farmers talking to farmers, sharing what works, what doesn't, is sort of a real educative process. And so groups like that can get, through the Jobs for Nature program, have been able to get some of the funding to help run those extension workshops. The levy from the levy revenue, that would also be invested back in supporting the transition. And it is a lot in extension services, but it's also having that strong regulatory framework as well, through things like the National Policy Statement for Fresh Water, strong regional rules. So you need both the incentives of having support, and one of the other ways that support can be provided is through this 1.3 billion that the Green Party really pushed for as part of our COVID economic response and recovery. A lot of that funding, there's 700 million in there for fresh water, and whether it's riparian planting, fencing, that's going to assist a lot of farmers around Aotearoa to actually start making that change.
Yeah. Very good. We have 136 people listening to us, Eugenie, which is great.
Kia ora koutou.
Kia ora. Good to have you all here. A slightly controversial issue. We still don't have a system under the emissions trading scheme for all its problems as a system of dealing with climate change in which the agricultural industry has to pay anything. Can you tell us where the Green Party stands on that? It was part of the New Zealand First Labour coalition agreement that agriculture would be brought into the emissions trading scheme, but that has not transpired. Where are we at on bringing ag into the ETS in a future term, potentially?
Well, that was one of the achievements of James Shaw as Climate Change Minister, getting the whole of Parliament to agree to the Zero Carbon Act. Because why that's really critical is it means that there won't, well, I noticed though that ACT recently is calling for major change there, but apart from ACT, having that multi-partisan agreement is critical in providing certainty for farming and all the growers and farmers, and ensuring that there's not a policy flip-flop when governments change in the future. And there is a commitment that agriculture comes in, but there's work being done at the moment in terms of whether farmers through farm environment plans and the like can develop an alternative system that will actually deliver. And if it doesn't, then there is that commitment in the legislation that agriculture does come in.
Okay, great. And is it possible they might come in at a higher rate than simply 5%?
Well, I think that's where, with the Climate Commission now established and working hard, a future government would obviously be very minded to accept any recommendations that the Climate Commission would make on that.
Yes, okay, great. Now, I have a very long question here from Ashley. Kia ora, Steve and Eugenie. I'm interested in your perspective on a mindset I've confronted from members of the farming community regarding their belief farming is made more efficient in Aotearoa due to the removal of direct subsidies under the fourth Labour government. How do you intend to change the discussion to reflect the more accurate view that farming in New Zealand is held captive to unnecessary debt, I believe it's about $62 billion, that causes farms to work out of touch of national needs, and that farmers would benefit from more direct government support to help them move away from damaging practices and mindsets around simply being another business to being an essential taonga?
Kia ora, why don't I have a crack at that, Steve, and then you. So it was interesting. I can remember being in the UK some years ago and buying some milk in a carton, and on the carton it said that the farmer was really pleased to have contributed to protecting the habitat I think it was of a fritillary butterfly, through wildflowers and the like that were on farm, and that had been assisted through the EU Common Agricultural Policy. And so the subsidies in Europe have enabled farmers to do set-asides, wild meadows and the like, which have protected biodiversity. And yes, I agree with Ashley that it is seen as a point of pride in our agricultural sector that we don't have subsidies because of those really traumatic reforms of the 1980s. But in many ways, nature has been subsidising farming for the last 2 decades with the whole intensification of dairying in particular. Mackenzie Basin converted to the tussocks gone in large areas, shrublands gone, and now ryegrass and clover. And our waterways have subsidised farming as well. So you're also right, the 62, the $1 billion debt and the stress for a lot of farmers that are heavily indebted through their mortgages to the banks. So the banks have contributed to this by not doing due diligence, by not having quadruple bottom line reporting or any examination of loan finance. So that's the problem. Shifting away from that, one option would be rapid rates of depreciation on, say, dairy sheds and the like, so that people can shift to growing or other forms of agriculture, not steering. As I said, there's 700 million in the clean water area. Quite a lot of that will be in riparian planting, restoration and the like. So it's not a subsidy, but it is providing some assistance to help farmers and growers speed up and do the right thing. So Ashley, probably that's not everything, but Steve, you've obviously got a perspective.
Yeah, very much. I mean, I think you're right. We've been subsidising unsustainable farming with nature, but also I think we've had these direct subsidy systems. A $400 million irrigation fund that we got rid of in this government, that the National Party had put in place. The ETS subsidy being an obvious one, that the fact that the agriculture industry doesn't pay its share of greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that understanding that to get a structural change in the way that we do farming, you have to be prepared to invest something to do that. You know, I mean, the Kapuni urea plant was built with, money, public money. So the way we got into this dependency on synthetic nitrogen fertilizer was through public investment, and we need to assist to get out of that dependency with some public investment. I think that's a reasonable expectation. I also had a quite profound experience when I was at Greenpeace, when Jen Toop and I went door knocking down in your neck of the woods and around Darfield. And we talked directly to farmers about what their views were of the Central Plains water irrigation scheme. And we learned a huge amount about how they had to make a very difficult choice to go into intergenerational debt by investing in this supposedly community water scheme that actually cost them thousands and thousands of dollars, and debts that would have to be carried by their children if they inherited the farms and so forth. So the burden of cost on farmers through a dependency, in that instance in the Canterbury area, on irrigation water was a huge burden, and also effectively subsidized, because there's no recognition of the long-term negative impact of that irrigation. And something like the Canterbury aquifer with higher nitrate levels as a consequence of that, a classic example of nature subsidizing unsustainable farming. So I think we need to be more imaginative, as that question implies, in terms of the way we think about what is a true subsidy and what is a way of transitioning to regenerative farming. I'm going to see if there's any more chats there. I've got a note saying, take your time answering these, maybe do some riffing. Okay. We can do that.
There was a related question, I think, about pressure on banks, and what work is the Green Party doing to put some pressure on banks in relation to that debt issue, and also whether we talk at all with Federated Farmers. Had a Zoom call with some members of the board of Federated Farmers last week. Yes, the Green Party does talk to Federated Farmers and Beef and Lamb and other farmer organisations. We've had some robust conversations over the years, but it is ensuring that you bring a diversity of views into formulating policy like the Farming for the Future plan. And in terms of pressure on the banks, it was past governments that really let that happen. And what we signalled, as Steve mentioned, was the wind up of the Crown Irrigation Fund, which was providing low-cost capital for schemes like Ruataniwha, Central Plains, and was part of a consultant's gravy train, and meant that all this feasibility work was done, a lot of it paid for by government or councils, to actually do these think big irrigation projects, which are just devastating for the waterways that they affect. So using the levers that we have, which is policies under the RMA, and also like the fertiliser levy, direct pressure on the banks, possibly legislation, but that's not part of the policy at the moment.
Yeah, cool. And on the irrigation thing, we still are not opposed to small-scale irrigation on farm. I have heard a criticism of that by certain water advocates that it could still add up to a death by 1,000 cuts. In advocating for the concept of soil, healthy organic soil is the best way to retain water. The soil, when it is healthy, acts like a sponge and is the best way of storing water, essentially. And that if we have lots of bigger and smaller sized on-farm water storage, as it's called, it could still have a similar effect to having large-scale water storage. Do you have a response to that kind of challenge?
It does definitely depend on what small scale is. And I think, though, some farms where just in the head of small catchments, people have put a little dam across, done planting, and created a wetland area. And the comments I made earlier about moving to be more responsive to dryland farming, and that is why in this the Greens need to be the core of government in the next term, because we need to ensure that the work that is done on allocation issues, water quantity issues, ensures that we've got ecological flows that council set in place for all small streams, because it's those small streams that are often critical for a lot of our Indigenous fish. And so, yes, do agree, we can't just be setting up small-scale dams everywhere.
That's great. We seem to have a complimentary comment from Gabrielle, who says that small organic farmers farming or trying to farm sustainably, it's been prohibitive for them because of the red tape and the lack of support from government. So that echoes what we were alluding to before, I think.
And didn't really talk about the Farming for the Future in terms of organics, but one comment that Gabrielle's right. If you're an organic farmer, you've got to pay to get accredited to have the certification that you are farming organically. But non-organic farmers don't have to pay for anything like that. The Green Party in the past has had government assistance for organic farmers, and a key part of our Farming for the Future plan is ensuring that there is extension services to enable farmers and growers to make that transition to organic and provide that support. And this issue of certification and how that's paid for, I think, is something we need to, in the next term of government, look at closely to remove that high barrier for getting involved in accreditation. The organics bill currently before Parliament was the Greens pushing that got that finally introduced, but we didn't get all of the changes that we wanted. So a stronger Green presence in the next Parliament would give us a better position to negotiate with whomever is Primary Industries Minister to get the changes to ensure that existing certification schemes like BioGrow and Demeter and the organisations behind those are able to have a much stronger role. It's not just government agencies. But yes, that cost needs to be changed, and much more support is part of our policy for organic farming. Yeah.
Very good. Can I ask you a quite big and broad question, Eugenie, which you probably didn't expect me to ask you? The RMA has been such a central part of our way of managing the environment for, since its inception in the 1980s. What's your view on where we need to go with it, and whether it's fundamentally working or whether we need a total rethink?
Well, I think the Randerson review, which was released a couple of months ago now, is suggesting that there be two pieces of legislation that replace the RMA, one for spatial planning and one concerning the built and the natural environment. And the Greens, we're still formulating our response to that quite thick report.
Yep.
And I think the RMA has, despite huge advocacy by community organisations, the Department of Conservation, and that was one of the first things I did as Minister, directed the department to advocate for nature as its act requires, which hadn't been happening under the national. But it is time for quite major reform, because the effects-based approach in the RMA has meant that you've had a lot of development and use happening and not a lot of protection.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. No, that's good. Good to get that answer. Thank you. Now, so I'm gonna ask perhaps if you would like to summarise anything, Eugenie, in terms of our Farming for the Future plan. What if, and I know bottom lines are a terrible thing, but if we had a bottom line piece of this policy that it was the only thing that we were going to definitely be able to implement in the next government, of which we're hopefully going to be some part, which would be the thing that you would choose? And this is a mean question because you had no warning of it.
And didn't have a lot of warning of the other ones either. So, no, I think the Greens go in with policy that is a package.
Yes.
So things like the nitrate levy, the ban on PKE, the 30 million for support for community gardens, for gardens, table and borrow schools and the like, the commercial charge on water, they all fit together to deal with different aspects of the issue. So I think we've got to look at them in the round. But in terms of the negotiation, that if we get a strong party vote for the Greens, we'd be in a position to do with Labour. It is the nitrate levy and the cap on nitrogen, I think, because that contributes to agricultural intensification. It allows that to continue, and also the nitrous oxide is really bad for the climate. So pushing further, pushing faster for a stable climate and for the suite of policies that can support that and also help protect nature, because that is the basis of all of our well-being. If Papatūānuku is healthy, then so are we. So start with the nitrate levy and the nitrate cap.
Yeah, fantastic. Those sound like a very good summing up and rounding up. So for the people who are listening and have been on this conversation, thank you so much for being here. If you feel that you support our Farming for the Future plan, let us know that you have our back. And there should be a petition posted in the comments, I believe, for you to click on and for you to do this. And of course, as Eugenie just said, if we want this sort of progressive, bold, transformational agricultural policy to become a reality, and all of our other policies around social justice, around healthy nature, around climate action, then of course we need to have more Green MPs. And the key for us to achieve that is the party vote. So we're really asking you and inviting you to give us the party vote this year. And if you're one of those super keen bean greens, which we may well have on this call, then get in amongst on the volunteering, because it's hugely helpful for us to achieve and grow that party vote. Get on the call hubs, make calls to people. When we're allowed to door knock, I don't know if you're in other parts of the country, I'm in Auckland, but when you're allowed to door knock, then that's actually a very enjoyable activity too, and hugely constructive for helping us get out the vote. And of course, don't forget to vote on the 17th of October, and early voting will be coming soon. So thanks so much for being here. Would you like to say anything else, Eugenie, to sort of wrap up?
Thank you for listening. Thank you for engaging. And we do grow some of the most delicious food and brilliant fibre in the world, but it is shifting to a much more sustainable regenerative system where we do well by the planet, by people, and have a healthy life for all. So that's what our Farming for the Future plan is about, making that change. And if the Greens are at the heart of the new government, we'll be in a position to negotiate that. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you for the really good questions. Kia ora.
Yeah, here to that. Now, Sian, I can't see the whakatalki that you were going to give me in the run sheet. Am I going to do the same one again? I did like it very much, actually, the one that we started with. Oh, here we have another one. This looks good as well. Just to say thank you so much for being here, everybody, and do make that party vote a green one. Ma te tini, ma mano, karapa te whai. By many, by thousands, the work will be accomplished. Kia ora koutou katoa. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you very much, Eugenie. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. And long may our green and pleasant land prosper, and may it become more regenerative. And we'll see you soon.